Hello and welcome to a Game Week 8 Premier League preview. Just before I start, I'm just going to make sure everything's working okay, so if you are here live, if you could please just send a message in the chat, that would be ideal. How's everything looking, guys? Is it all working alright? All good, perfect. Thank you very much for confirming that, Reese. So, thank you for joining. I'm good. How are you? Welcome to another live stream, returning back to the Premier League after an international break. Obviously, we're 8 weeks into the season now, coming along quite nicely. So, we've got now a bit more data to go off. We're a bit more informed with our decisions. So, hopefully, we can use that to our advantage. It's worth noting that generally you find that books become a bit sharper at this point in the season, so value becomes a bit harder to find. But I think there's quite a lot on offer this weekend, so without wasting any more time, the first game to cover is Ipswich against Everton. Gonna skip the early kickoff for this, Tottenham against West Ham. But I do have quite a lot of angles for that game, and I'll be covering it more in detail in a thread. So if you're not already following me on Twitter, make sure you are. Got quite a lot lined up for that one, so that is something to look forward to. First game for the stream though is Ipswich against Everton, 3 o'clock kickoff at Portman Road. Ipswich sit just above the drop zone, but they are yet to pick up their first win in the Premier League. They have a record of 4 draws, 3 losses, and last time out they were pretty comprehensively beaten by West Ham at the London Stadium. They look really poor defensively. For the visitors, Everton sit just 1 place above Ipswich in 16th, but they are unbeaten in 3, so have sort of picked up a bit. Last time out, there was a goalless draw played out against Newcastle, a scoreline which probably didn't do Newcastle any justice. There was quite a lot of chances for the visitors. Anthony Gordon obviously missed a penalty, so I think Sean Dyche was a bit lucky in that game. Moving on to the injury report, Kieran McKenna highlighted how he's quite close to being able to pick a full squad, with Broadhead sort of nearing a return. Only notable absentee will be Axel Tuanzebe, who remains out with a hand injury, which means Ben Johnson will likely return to right back. Mikalenko for Everton is a doubt, as is Patterson and Coleman, which leaves the Toffees a bit light at fullback. So we could see James Garner again deputised in a sort of unfamiliar position. Jared Branthwaite is a 50-50, and again I think his presence makes a real difference for Everton, so that's one to keep an eye on. First angle for me is for McNeil to register 2 or more shots, which is priced at 1.73 with Paddy Power. I think this is one of the best prices of the weekend. Reason being, I think Paddy Power have been quite slow to pick up on a positional change, and that is with the arrival of Iliman Ndiaye. He sort of secured a starting position on the left where McNeil would normally play, which has shifted McNeil into a sort of central attacking midfield role, sort of behind the striker. His first game in that role was against Bournemouth, and since then he's had 2 or more shots in 5 out of 6 games, only failing against Aston Villa, where he had 1 of just 6 shots in total for Everton. So that was obviously a much tougher matchup than Ipswich will be. I mentioned that Ipswich were really poor against West Ham. I think they were getting bypassed in midfield way too easily. So they provide a good matchup to target sort of opposition shots. When you consider the matchup, when you consider that McNeil has played the full 90 minutes in 5 of those 6 games, at least 80 minutes in all of them, we're sort of targeting a player with a high expected minutes in a very attacking role. He'll be on free kicks. So I think getting 2+ shots at anywhere near evens is quite surprising. So I think definitely ladder potential here. Could maybe look to add a shot on target in there, 3 shot on target, that kind of ladder. But I think as a baseline, 2+ shots at 1.73 is a fantastic sort of value, fantastic starting point for the weekend. Moving on, obviously, with McNeil shifting into a central role, the person to accommodate him has been Abdoulaye Doucouré. I mentioned this last, or sort of before the international break, that he's played in a more defensive midfield role. And I think Everton sort of have a surplus in that position. They have quite a few players who can play in that defensive midfield role, but with them being quite light at fullback, it's sort of shifted Garner into a fullback role, and it's allowed Doucouré to pick up some high minutes in a defensive midfield role, which is obviously ideal. So if we look into his foul data, he's played the last 3 games in that defensive midfield role, and he's made exactly 3 fouls in all of those games. So that's certainly one to keep an eye on. So 3 fouls against Leicester, 3 fouls against Palace, 3 fouls against Newcastle. Obviously, the Newcastle matchup is a good one, but I wouldn't say Palace or Leicester are a particularly great matchup for fouls. So that data looks encouraging in that sense. He is very, very short across the industry. So this sort of next angle, which is Doucouré to make 2 or more fouls, is only really backable on Unibet or BetMGM. So if you are lucky enough to have one of those accounts, I would take that value instantly. The general price across the industry is around 1.6, around that sort of price. So getting it odds against for 2 fouls is like massive, and I would take that instantly. As I say though, it is only with Unibet, so I doubt I'll be sort of posting this one. However, I sort of understand that there are quite a few people with a active Unibet account if you're from other countries than the UK, so I would advise taking advantage of that value whilst it still holds. Next up, I'm sort of focusing on a few individual matchups in this game. I think we do get some nice value, especially looking to take advantage of Ben Johnson starting at right back. Assuming Iliman Ndiaye starts, that's a really, really like enticing matchup to target, and the reason being is Ndiaye has been a magnet for drawing fouls and drawing tackles on the wing. He's a lot more direct in his approach than a McNeil, and you can see in every start he's sort of had for Everton, he has drawn a foul. He's averaging 1.45 fouls drawn per 90, and he will be directly up against Ben Johnson in this game. The former West Ham man has pretty limited data because he hasn't been a regular starter for quite a few seasons now, but he has made a foul in 2 out of 3 starts for Ipswich, including 2 fouls against Man City, and now he obviously draws an ideal matchup. So considering he's priced at 1.62 to commit a foul with Paddy Power and Sky, I think that does look a bit too big on the surface. A sort of potential approach you could do is Johnson to commit a foul and Ndiaye to be fouled, which comes out at 2.04 with Paddy, and you're covered with super subs. So that's a potential angle that I really like as a start up. Another matchup to sort of keep an eye on is Liam Delap and Tarkowski, 2 very sort of physical, 2 very aggressive players who will sort of occupy the same zone of the field. I think Delap is a really good matchup for targeting fouls drawn, because he's drawn an average of 1.69 fouls per 90, which is considerable. It's quite a notable value. He tends to put himself about because he's quite a lot of the ball, and he's good at holding up the ball. Tarkowski, on the other hand, has committed a foul in 5 out of 7 games this season. So I think it's probably best waiting to see if Jared Branthwaite plays. I think there's a sort of clear... there's a difference in Tarkowski between how he plays with Jared Branthwaite and if he was to have a different centre-back partner. I think he's a lot more aggressive with Branthwaite because he knows he has a sort of competent partner in that sense, so he can be a bit more aggressive, and yeah, he can afford to be a bit more tight on his opposition striker, looking to win the ball back sort of earlier. But I do like that matchup. Again, I think a combination of a Tarkowski foul and Liam Delap foul drawn comes out as backable. An alternative sort of angle, so those are sort of leans for now. But another way to approach that is I think Njai sort of draws a really good matchup against the Ipswich midfield sort of double pivot. I think those two, so Calvin Phillips and Sam Morsey, very aggressive in their approach, a bit clumsy as well in a sense. And I think if you're sort of worried about Ben Johnson as a matchup, given his sort of lack of data, I think getting Njai foul drawn on side is a really nice approach. And I think he's priced at 1.36 to draw a foul with Paddy Power, which is obviously a little bit on the short side, but still decent value, I would say, given the data. You could double that with Liam Delap to draw a foul, which comes out at 1.8 with Sky. So yeah, I think there's plenty of sort of ways to approach it, plenty of angles to sort of attack this game, attack fouls drawn, which I think is a sort of sensible approach. Given sort of where the two sides lie in the table, I think it could be quite sort of chaotic game, which again lends itself to sort of fouls and tackles. Being a 3 o'clock game, we are a bit limited in the market, so again, have to be a bit smart with your approach here. Main angles though will be Decore to make 2 fouls and McNeil to have 2 shots, with ladder potential for both. So that's all for the 3 o'clock games. All of the rest will be televised kickoffs, so full markets. And we're going to stay with the Sunday game. Bournemouth against Arsenal, one of the more enticing matchups of the weekend, I would say. Thank you very much for that message, Gian Batra. Appreciate your support. So yeah, Bournemouth against Arsenal, 5:30 televised kickoff at the Vitality. It's been an inconsistent start for the Cherries. They've been sort of one of the more difficult teams to predict, I would say. They currently sit in 13 with a mixed bag of results, and last time they were beaten by Leicester at the King Power. Obviously not an ideal sort of result given that they were favourites and they did create a lot of chances in that game. For Arsenal, they were able to extend their unbeaten league run with victory over Southampton in their previous outing. It was a very similar game to the one before that against Leicester. I think it was sort of complete domination from Arsenal, but they made the game a lot harder than it should have been in the end. But again, as all good teams do, they got the victory. In terms of the injury report for Bournemouth, it's only Tyler Adams listed, which is obviously a good sign for Iraola. He's got pretty much a full contingent available to him with no changes over the international break. However, Arsenal have a much more extensive injury list, with Odegaard the only one really certainly out. You've got Ben White, Timber, Saka, Havertz, Partey and Martinelli all listed as doubtful. So it's probably worth waiting for the sort of Arteta press conference. But I would imagine a lot of these guys are ready to start on Sunday evening. So with that in mind, I think I'll give my prediction on how the game will go, because that sort of plays a pretty big bearing over the bets for this. So Arsenal last season won this game 3-0 and 4-0, so they were very, very comfortable against Bournemouth. And I think stylistically they should be, because sort of Bournemouth's main sort of threat comes from their attack. I think they're very forward thinking, they're very progressive, and they tend to outscore teams rather than sort of keep them out. They're not a very defensive team, they're not very compact. They do allow their opponents to have chances. But I think Arsenal have the perfect antidote to their attack. I think Arsenal are obviously the best defensive team in the league, probably in the world right now. And as I say, they kept 2 clean sheets against Bournemouth last season. So I don't think they'll be too worried about sort of how attack-minded Bournemouth will be. And I think because of that, they can really cause problems on the break. And I think, thinking about how they match up, I think Arsenal come into this game in really good form. And I think they'll really cause Bournemouth a ton of problems on the break. And because of that, I do think Arsenal win this game relatively comfortably. Of course, that could be quite wrong, but I'm going to assume Arsenal are very comfortable victors in this game. And because of that, I do think they'll sort of naturally tend to sit deeper and concede possession. I think when Arsenal do take the lead, they are a bit more relaxed in their approach. They look to sort of utilise their sort of counter-attacking proficiencies, and that could be really dangerous against the Bournemouth side, who can look quite vulnerable in transition. And we saw that happen in both games last season between these two. So, because of that, assuming an Arsenal lead is probable, I think Lewis Cook passes is a natural target. If we look into his data last season, Cook made 43 passes at the Emirates and 50 passes at home, so covered this line relatively easily. For the season, he's over this line in 4 out of 7. That includes 58 passes in the previous game against Leicester, who obviously took the lead early, sat a bit deeper, which is a sort of similar approach to which I hope Arsenal will have. He's also over this line against against Liverpool at Anfield and Newcastle at home. So he's shown he can sort of cover this line in tougher matchups. And he's covered it in both head-to-head games last season. So over 39.5 passes at 1.83 with Bet365 is the first angle for me. Potentially a ladder there, up to sort of the 42.5. Just hoping that line doesn't shift too much, but that's what it is at the moment. Again, before the international break, I did mention that we've seen a sort of tactical shift from Arsenal, which is seeing them sort of reverse how their centre-backs sort of approach the game. We've seen Gabriel be a bit more reserved and Saliba sort of take on the role as the more aggressive in the pairing. And because of that, we've seen an uptick in tackles for Saliba. So he's made at least 2 tackles in 8 out of 9 games this season. And we see him sort of drawn out of position a little bit more, but he's also fantastically adept in his duels. He's very strong in his challenges. And because of that, he's dribbled past very few times and he's very efficient in his tackles. So naturally, that makes him one to target. He's actually priced at 1.66 for 2 tackles, which, given that it's landed in 8 out of 9, looks a really good price on the surface. Also, you need to consider that it's a good matchup against Bournemouth, a team who sort of play very direct. They look to get the ball into the feet of their striker as often as possible. So I think because of that, we should see plenty of involvement for Saliba on the defensive front, and therefore I really like that price. 1.66 is obviously a little bit too short to back as a single. So the sort of angle I have in mind is for a Bournemouth player to have a shot. I think it was, for me, a toss-up between Tavernier and Semenyo to have at least one shot. But I've gone for Tavernier in the end. I think that's a smarter approach because he's the higher price, first of all. But he also plays in a more central role. He'll be on free kicks and he tends to shoot more often from distance, which could be useful against a team like Arsenal where sort of clear-cut chances could be less common. He's had a shot in all 8 games this season, including 1 at Anfield, 2 against Chelsea, 2 against Newcastle. So again, he's shown that he can sort of cover this line in sort of tougher matchups. And the double, so Saliba over 1.5 tackles and Tavernier to have 1 shot, comes out at 1.9, which I think is a really, really nice double. Looks good value on the surface. Next up, I'm going to stick with Bet365, but this time targeting fouls. So Christie is the first man to target. He's priced at 1.36 to commit a foul with 365. And I think even without looking at the data, just off the eye test, you can immediately see that Christie is going to be a good person to target for fouls. He presses very intensely, quite clumsily at times, and therefore he sees himself in a lot of duels. He's made a foul in 7 out of 8 appearances this season, and he made 3 fouls the last time he faced Arsenal. So really like him for at least 1 foul. Again, potential to ladder. I'm pairing that with Calafiori to make a foul for Arsenal. So he's expected to start at right back on Saturday evening, which should put him in direct duels with Antoine Semenyo, which is a really, really nice matchup to target, I think, given how much of the ball Semenyo sees generally for Bournemouth. He's also drawn a foul in each of his last 6 games. Meanwhile, Calafiori, since sort of starting this season, has an average of 2.16 fouls per 90, which is a very, very high total, and he's made a foul in all 5 of his starts. So notable data, carded in 3 of his games too. So really good data, really good matchup, and the double of Christie foul and Calafiori foul comes out at 1.95. So again, really, really nice price. And I think there is potential to ladder there as well, especially if sort of Calafiori can see somewhere close to the 90. So when he's played the 90, he's made at least 2 fouls in 2 out of 3 games. So it's an enticing matchup. I also would like to double down on a long shot for this game where I sort of put all the angles together. And I'll be posting that, sort of confirming that on Twitter again. So make sure you're following me, hoping that the sort of odds hold. I don't see any reason why they shouldn't. But yeah, make sure you're following me on Twitter. I'll have that posted tomorrow, hopefully. That's all for Saturday games. Moving on to Sunday, we have Wolves against Man City as a 2 p.m. kickoff at Molineux. The hosts sit rock bottom of the league, 1 draw, 6 losses. It's been a nightmare start for them. However, it's worth noting that they've had an extremely difficult run of fixtures, playing the likes of Villa, Liverpool, Chelsea, Newcastle, Arsenal and Brighton, which is 6 of the top 7. And the other game is Forest away. So very, very tough fixtures on the surface, and I do expect a regression. I don't think the performances have been great, but I don't think they've been as bad as the results suggest. So, as I say, maybe waiting for a bit of a regression for Wolves. Don't think it will come on Sunday, but again, just want to sort of watch out for. Man City sit in second, 1 point off Liverpool. They most recently beat Fulham 3-2. However, the visitors had plenty of clear-cut chances, mostly through Adama Traore. I think City really, really struggled to contain him. And they have just generally struggled in sustaining pressure without the likes of Rodri and De Bruyne. Looking a bit poor in transition as well. So, something to keep an eye on for this game. I think for the injury report, Mosquera is the most notable sort of recent addition for Wolves. Other than that, I think we're expecting quite a defensive approach. Potentially 3 centre-backs and sort of wing-backs formation for Wolves. But I think given how Fulham was so dangerous on the break, I think Wolves are a similar sort of matchup in that sense for City, given how they have quite powerful runners, powerful carriers through the likes of Mateus Cunha, Ryan Nouri, Bellegarde if he starts. So I can really see Wolves sort of causing problems here. Rodri and De Bruyne remain as the key absentees for City. But I think Pep Guardiola's been a bit more unpredictable in his lineups with his team selection in recent game weeks. So it's a bit difficult to sort of suggest how they start. But I would imagine it's Doku and Savinho on the flanks, with sort of Walker starting over Rico Lewis to just help sort of contain Ait Nouri. I think you need a more physical presence for this game against Wolves. So angle 1 is for Guardiola to have a shot, which is priced at 1.5, top price with William Hill. Obviously too short as a single, so I'm pairing that with João Gomez to make 2 or more fouls, and the double comes out at 2.5 with William Hill. Again, I expect Wolves to low block in this game. If we look into their head-to-head data last season against Man City, they had just 5 shots across the 2 games, so ridiculously low. And I don't think there's any reason for Gary O'Neill to sort of chuck away that blueprint. I think we see a very similar setup for Wolves. And because of that, I think we sort of see Man City dominate in the final third. I think we see the likes of Guardiola play with a bit more freedom and sort of more willingness to get into the box. I think whenever he plays a sort of low block side, we see Guardiola sort of operate in the sort of left half space, and because he's right-footed, he sort of naturally tends to find himself in quite good shooting positions from distance, which obviously he does tend to take up as well. Since Rodri's injury, we've obviously seen the role of Guardiola increase a lot more, sort of parallel to how he played towards the end of last season. So plays very, very attacking, gets into the box, and he's obviously a massive set-piece threat. If we look into his shot data, he's actually had a shot in 5 out of 6 of his last games. Interestingly, he's actually had a shot on target in all of those as well. So you can see 3 shots, 1, 2, 1, 2. Shot on target is landed in all of those as well. So as a potential lean, you can back Guardiola to have a shot on target at 2.37 with Bet365, or top price, unsurprisingly, Unibet at 2.8. So I think that's a sort of good starting point. Too short as a single at 1.5, but looking into sort of João Gomez, we've seen a bit of a slight change since the sort of introduction of Andre in midfield alongside him. I think what's interesting is how his role is adapted. So in the first start for Andre, we saw João Gomez play in a bit more of a deeper role as a 6 in this game against Newcastle, and obviously he didn't make a foul. But since then, we've sort of seen a more expected approach from Gary O'Neill, in which Andre has been the sort of lone 6 with Lamina and João Gomez in front of him. And that playing in that role gives João Gomez a bit more freedom to be more intense in his press, sort of look to win the ball back higher up the field. And because of that, he's sort of seen an uptick in fouls since that game. So if we exclude this Newcastle game, because he was in a different role, you can see his foul data is pretty ridiculous. 2+ fouls landed in the vast majority of games this season. Again, with Wolves expected to deploy a low block, I wouldn't be surprised to see if Andre drops out of the starting 11 or João Gomez drops out of the starting 11 in favour of a centre-back. So maybe one to just keep an eye on. But 2+ fouls has landed in 6 out of 8 games, one of them being in that Newcastle game, as I said. If we look into his head-to-head data against Man City last season, he made 8 fouls in the 2 league games, with 4 fouls in each of them. So again, expecting a sort of similar approach from Gary O'Neill. I think João Gomez is a target for fouls, as always, and I really like that double to start things off. Next angle for me is for Man City to make over 12.5 tackles, which on the surface just looks a very, very low line. With Bet365, it's priced at 1.9. Looking into the head-to-head data last season, Man City made 15 tackles in both games against Wolves. And when you just think about how Wolves approached that game, they were quite reliant on using their main dribblers, so Matheus Cunha, Ryan Nouri, sort of progress the ball up the field as opposed to playing long balls. And I think because of that, naturally lends itself to thinking about tackles for Man City. Obviously, Man City have lacked a bit of control without Rodri, as mentioned, and they've actually hit this line in 4 out of 5 league games in which Rodri has not started. So I think, just because of that, on the surface, it just looks an extremely low line, given how Wolves are sort of expected to approach this game, given the data from last season. So I do think that's a nice selection to take advantage of. Again, also given the head-to-head data. Next angle is for Kovacic to commit a foul at 1.57, which again just looks way too big on the surface, considering Kovacic will be the sort of defensive midfielder against the Wolves side, who generally are very direct in their approach in terms of dribblers. It's landed in both head-to-head games last season, and now we see sort of Kovacic take up a more defensive role, so really like it. He's made a foul in 3 out of his last 4 games for Man City. Again, 1.57, probably a bit too short to back as a single. So to get the odds up, what I would suggest is to pair it with something like a Haaland shot on target, something very sort of bog standard, something quite basic. And doing that, you can actually get the odds up to 1.8, which is backable and pretty nice price actually when you consider that Haaland has unsurprisingly had a shot on target in every game so far this season, excluding the Community Shield against Man United. He's been in ridiculous goal scoring form, with 2+ shots on target landing in 8 out of 9, and he's already scored 11 goals this season. So I think if you're going to target anyone, it has to be Haaland. I also really like his matchup against a Wolves side who have been really, really poor defensively. Obviously, mentioned that Mosquera will be out, so we're likely to get a centre-back pairing of Craig Dawson and Bueno. Not ideal for Gary O'Neill. And And the last time Haaland faced Wolves at the Etihad, obviously this is not the Etihad, but he scored 4 goals against Wolves. So it's a team that he probably looked forward to facing, and you wouldn't put it past him scoring in this game. Again, just to mention a sort of top price from Unibet, won't be sort of posted by me, but Unibet are massive on Haaland. They've actually got him 1.72 to score any time, and the same price for 2 or more shots on target, which I think if you have access to a Unibet account or BetMGM account, it's a price that you should really be taking advantage of. I think it's much shorter elsewhere, and rightfully so. So that'll be all for the Wolves-Man City game. I think there's quite a few angles of interest there. Now moving on to the biggest game of the weekend, Liverpool against Chelsea, 4:30 kickoff on Sunday. Liverpool made it 6 wins in all competitions since their shock defeat to Forest at home, after most recently beating Crystal Palace. They've conceded 3 goals in those 6 games, but I think it's worth noting that they have been conceding chances. They're obviously a lot stronger defensively under Arne Slot than they were under Jurgen Klopp. They're a lot more controlled in their approach, but they're not as strong as the current numbers suggest, I would say. And I think we are due a sort of regression. Chelsea have also been in great form, unbeaten in 7, and they were held to a draw last time out against Forest at Stamford Bridge. Unable to sort of get the decisive goal despite Forest being reduced to 10 men in the 75th minute. In terms of the injury report, sort of most notable change for Liverpool will be Alisson out. Obviously, he injured himself against Palace. Kelleher also missed that game due to a virus, but you would imagine he sort of fills in for this game instead of Jaros, who did cope pretty well, I would say. McAllister is a small doubt. I think he came off at half-time in the previous game against Palace, but should be ready to start. For Chelsea, a bit more assurance in here with Cucurella and Fofana suspended, so they'll definitely be out. Reece James recently returned to training, but you would imagine this game has come too soon for him to start. Just before sort of going into any angles, I think it's worth mentioning that although this is the biggest game of the weekend and most naturally also have the most bets on it, I think it's a massive banana skin, and I would sort of advise you to be a bit wary with it. Here's why. So Liverpool have played just one team in the top half this season, and it was against Forest, who currently sit in 10th. I think it's undeniable that they've obviously looked a lot more composed, a lot better under Arne Slot, but this will be his biggest test of the season so far, and I think it makes the current data set that we have a bit unreliable to use. Same goes to Chelsea for an extent, who are missing key players. But again, excluding their sort of 2-0 loss to City at the start of the season, they haven't really faced a side as potent as Liverpool yet. So for both sides, we have to be a bit careful in how we interpret the data. With that being said, I have got one angle that I'm fairly confident in, and that is for Nicholas Jackson to have a shot on target, which is 1.8 with Paddy Power. Now, this is the same price with Bet365, but I would only take it if you have a Paddy Power account. Reason being is the super sub rule. So Jackson rarely finishes the 90, and Nkunku is his replacement. So he's an extremely worthy player to get onside here. But Jackson has landed a shot on target in every game so far this season, including against Man City, and Chelsea just haven't really struggled with chance creation at all. I think they've been very, very good going forward. They've looked extremely efficient, and Jackson has sort of been on the end of some really good chances. He did have a shot on target against Man City as well, so we sort of hit this in the toughest matchup of the season so far. Moving on to Liverpool, I think they did look a bit vulnerable against Palace. Obviously, Alisson and Jaros combined for 5 saves, so they can be got at. Did obviously mention that their defensive data can be a bit misleading. They've conceded the lowest XG, but again, sort of fixture dependent. But again, it's the super sub rule which here is key. I think Nkunku scored in the last time he faced Liverpool, so he will be confident returning back to Anfield. And and he is pretty much always the replacement for Nicholas Jackson. Sorry. So that's my first angle for this one. The rest are just sort of leans for now. I think they all sort of have value in their own way, but it's about how can you combine them and how can you make the most of it. So the first angle in mind is for Trent to make 2 or more tackles, which is slightly shorter than expected, but given that it's landed in 8 games straight and in 8 out of 9 games under Arne Slot, I think it's a really sort of nice price to take advantage of, given that he'll also have a good matchup against either Jadon Sancho or more likely Pedro Neto, 2 obviously quite direct opponents who will look to get at him. He's averaging the most tackles for Liverpool since Arne Slot took over, which is again a good sign, and I do think there's ladder potential given the matchup. Sticking on Bet365, Szoboszlai is priced at 1.5 to make a foul, which has also landed in 8 out of 9 appearances under Arne Slot. If we think into how Szoboszlai's role has adapted, he's still sort of playing in a more advanced midfield role, but you do see him sort of be a bit more intent on recovering the ball, sort of tracking back, and he is more aggressive in his press, I would say, which is sort of reflected in those foul counts. So he's averaging 1.39 fouls per 90, and I think he draws a good matchup here against the Chelsea midfielders Caicedo and Enzo Fernandez, but given his work rate, sort of tends to find duels against a lot of opposition players, whether it be the fullbacks, whether it be the centre-backs, or even the wingers at times. So if he can sort of play somewhere near the 90, I think him to make a foul at 1.5 looks a really nice price. Sticking on a similar line of thought, Caicedo drew 3 fouls in both head-to-head games against Liverpool last season. The reason I mention this data, obviously, there's 2 new managers, so is it relevant? I think so, because the Liverpool press hasn't changed too much under Arne Slot. I think that's one of the common ground between Klopp and Slot has been the sort of intensity of the press. It's still very aggressive, and on a similar note, the role of Caicedo hasn't really changed too much as well from last season to this season, and I think that's reflected in sort of similar numbers for shots, tackles, fouls, etc. So I think it is relevant to use the head-to-head data in this scenario, and given that Caicedo to draw 2 or more fouls is 1.91, I think that's a nice price. It's landed in 3 out of 7 this season, but again, it's based on how Liverpool sort of press strongly, particularly in the midfield. Their midfielders, McAllister, Gravenberch, Szoboszlai, are sort of ranking with the highest total of fouls. So, I think ideal matchup, and 1.91 for 2 fouls drawn is decent, with ladder potential there. Another sort of sticking on the same line of thought with fouls drawn, Cole Palmer is averaging 2.62 fouls drawn per 90 this season for Chelsea, which is amongst the highest sort of average. Against Liverpool last season, he drew 4 fouls and 2 fouls. So to see 2 or more fouls drawn at 2.7 with Paddy Power looks a bit excessive on the surface. Again, really good data from last season. I think he'll be used as a sort of outlet for Chelsea. They'll look to get him on the ball as much as possible. He might look to drop deeper at times, and again, he should find the matchup of Gravenberch, McAllister, potentially even Szoboszlai and Konate at times. So 4 ideal players who are very aggressive for Liverpool and sort of commit high numbers of fouls. But yeah, as I say, all of those are sort of leans apart from the Nicholas Jackson shot on target price. We'll need to have a deeper look into this, and I will be having a deeper look into this. So stay tuned for a sort of expansive thread on Twitter. I plan to go into this one in quite a lot of detail. So make sure you follow me there on Twitter again. And that will finish off the Sunday bets. The last game to cover is Nottingham Forest against Crystal Palace, which is the final fixture of the game week. It's Monday Night Football, kickoff at the City Ground. Forest have only lost 1 game this season. They've been sort of draw specialists, 4 draws from 7 games. It's worth noting that I think we've seen a massive improvement defensively from them since the addition of Milenkovic, who's been a real presence and formed a great partnership with Murillo. After the highs of last season, Oliver Glasner has sort of experienced a serious regression as his side are yet to register a win and sit in the relegation zone. Successive defeats to the Merseyside clubs Everton and Liverpool has really put the pressure on, and he'll be looking for a positive result from this game. He'll be quite desperate, I would say. In terms of the injury report, quite a lot to consider for both sides. Ward-Prowse is suspended after his double yellow card against Chelsea, while Sangare is also out. Gibbs-White is also doubtful after picking up an injury just before the international break. So Forest are a bit light in midfield, but they do have quite a lot of options. I expect Ryan Yates to start alongside potentially Elliot Anderson, with Nicholas Dominguez potentially featuring in a sort of more advanced midfield role if Gibbs-White is to miss out. For Crystal Palace, they'll be without Chadi Riyad and Chris Richards at the back, while Munoz is also a doubt after being taken off against Liverpool. Adam Wharton also is doubtful, so there's quite a few variables to consider for both teams here. We can expect a few changes. And whilst that is obviously, it makes prediction a bit harder, it can also create sort of opportunity. So again, final game. It's quite a long way away. It's on Monday night, so we haven't really got many lines available. I'm going to keep this section short. And the first sort of lean for me will be Murillo 2+ tackles, which is priced at 1.9 with Bet365. Now, this is not a particularly data-driven selection, but Murillo, from the eye test, is a player that I would like to target for fouls because he's a lot more aggressive with Milenkovic. He's sort of given a lot more freedom to get tight to his opposition striker. The only sort of worry for me is he's not a very efficient player for targeting tackles, and what I mean by that is he does put himself in a lot of duels, but more often than not he'll be sort of dribbled past or commit a foul as opposed to making a tackle. So if we look into his tackle counts this season, he's only made 2 tackles in 2 out of 7 games, but I do really like this matchup. If we again look into his foul data, this is a potential lean or a potential other angle to go into. He's made at least 2 fouls in 3 out of 7, with at least 1 foul in 5 out of 7. So sort of highlights how he is very aggressive in his approach. He likes to get tight to the opposition striker. As I say, the data doesn't really corroborate to target tackles in this one, given that it's only landed in 2 out of 7. But it did land in both head-to-head games last season against Crystal Palace. And I think against if it's Mateta who starts or Nketiah, I think against Nketiah you'd want to be targeting fouls because obviously he's a bit less of a physical presence, tends to go down a bit more easily. But if he is up against Mateta, which I would imagine he is, I would say Mateta starts this game. You think that's a fantastic sort of battle between 2 very physical players, and I would say tackles is the more natural pick in that matchup. So again, maybe worth waiting for team sheets. The next angle for me is actually assuming Nketiah starts as the central striker, and it's for him to have a shot on target at 1.72. I think that's a really good price considering the sort of player that Nketiah is. He started as the focal point of the attack against Liverpool. Not sure if he will again, but he had 1 shot on target. And he's a very selfish player, which is not a bad thing, especially when you're targeting him for shots. He has an eye for goal, and he's generally shoot first as opposed to pass, which is ideal. If we look into his shot data since completing the move to Crystal Palace, you can see he's averaging 3.05 shots per 90. He's had a shot on target in 4 out of 5 games. Only sort of issue is his expected minutes and the position in which he plays. If he is to play as a central striker, I think shot on target is probably the sort of way to approach it. If he is to play as inside forward, sort of alongside Eze, probably best to target things like shots, but have to appreciate that his minutes will probably be limited in that role. But he's landed a shot on target against Liverpool, against Man United, so he's sort of shown that he can hit this line in tougher matchups. I think Forest are a tough matchup, But again, considering on where he plays, I think 1.72 does just look a bit too high with 365, and I think they will be top price when everyone else releases. But as I say, this game is still quite a while away. It's on Monday night. We're still waiting for markets to release, and I also think it's a bit of a banana skin fixture given the sort of injuries to both teams. And also Palace are in very poor form. So approach this game with caution. But that will be... thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for supporting the stream. Remember to stay tuned on Twitter, as I say. I'll be posting quite a few detailed articles and threads this weekend, full write-ups, and also make sure to be in on my Telegram channel where all of my staking plans will be posted for each bet. So again, thank you for supporting, and I will see you all next Thursday. So take care and have a great day.